Notes for the Planetary Transition and the Law of Return by Daniel Gagliardo. Notebook 4. Life in Uksim has no other purpose than to manifest the work of the souls. A planetary service group has no other purpose than to serve as a mirror to the higher consciousness. The will of that consciousness must be fulfilled by a spiritual working group. Without asking, without waiting, the task is to express the evolutionary plan. Without casing, untiringly. Without feeding illusions, without speculation, without evaluations, only attentive to what comes from the observation of the internal law. What is rehearsed at the center in the group environment is impossible to be lived individually. When souls can extend their work in communion and fraternity to the concrete level, the liberated energy energizes the planetary sphere. With the purpose which this orb must develop in some stage of its manifestation, the communion between the incarnated beings on the surface of the planet is foreseen. That is to say, it is foreseen that the souls not only can be connected in love wisdom in the internal sphere of existence, but that quality is reflected in the interaction that their respective extensions maintain in the material side of life. Daniel Gagliardo. Note 19. At the moment of sitting down in front of the computer, the topic for which we would continue to deepen these realities was not yet present in our consciousness. We only knew that it was time to fulfill the commitment made to this newspaper. It had been a few weeks since we had returned from Uruguay. We had traveled to this neighboring country to give some talks and to attend instances for our group work. At least those were the reasons for that trip. At a certain point in our learning process, we were given the opportunity to understand that an external movement can be the manifestation of different realities simultaneously, as well as those realities, apparently different, are only shades of a single and deep reality. Unexpectedly, I remembered a question which someone slipped into one of the meetings that had taken place during that stay. What can we say to the people who ask what Uksim does, what is the meaning of the work that group does in Sierra del Cielo? Displaced by other comments, what had come to our ears through this question was left out of treatment in the context where the meeting was focused. However, as it usually happens, that consultation had timely shown up to implant an element which sooner or later would act as a trigger. In the front of the keyboard, the shot had become concrete. Many times we had talked about life in Uksim. Undoubtedly, the subject needed to be reviewed and explored because of the profiles and scope that only a newspaper can offer. The transmission of impulses in the cosmic sphere of existence is something straightforward. The elements that participate in that infinite circuit must only be in a position to express the energy of the unique consciousness. Willpower, the essential tool of that higher consciousness, must find availability and receptivity of the elements. This energy must be accepted by the material levels. In the case of humanity on the surface of this planet, in general, these higher sources reaches the causal level with minimum restrictions. It is in that level where the nucleus of the soul participates in an almost unexpected expression of existence in the context of three-dimensional planetary life. This expression can be described as union, brotherhood, communion between consciousness. Also, it can be defined as a group work. Souls work in groups. The 12 inner groups. The essential condition is represented in group work. In this way, in the internal level closest to the concrete plan, they sustain the coding of the cosmic foundation of existence. Life in Uksim has no other purpose than to manifest that work of souls. A group of planetary surface has no other purpose than to serve as a mirror to the higher consciousness. The will of that consciousness must be fulfilled by a spiritual working group. Without asking, without waiting, the task is to express the evolutionary plan, without casing untiringly, without feeding illusions, without speculations, without evaluations, only attentive to what comes for the observation of the internal law. What is experienced at the center in a group environment is impossible to be lived individually. When souls can extend their work in communion and fraternity to the concrete level, the liberated energy energizes the planetary sphere. Within the purpose which this orb must develop in some stage of its manifestation, the communion between the incarnated beings on the surface of this planet is foreseen. That is to say, it is foreseen that the souls not only can be linked in love-wisdom in the internal spheres of existence, but that quality is reflected in the interaction that their respective extensions maintain in the material side of life. The task of a center is not to construct buildings, not to make gardens, not to crystallize into schemes of any kind, although some of these issues can be very useful to its purpose. The task of a center is to connect concrete existence to harmony, to the regency of the unique life. It is to offer to humanity and to life of the planet an environment where beings can consciously live, feel that they are one indivisible essence, that their filaments, that a single light become incandescent. As long as the center lasts in its expression, its task is not done. The manifestation by itself should serve as an incentive for those who are internally connected to it to guard its purpose. This custody has nothing to do with attitudes which this humanity could link to the term. Whoever belongs to the expression of a center, Uksim, as revealed in our first dissemination booklets, is a state of consciousness, a vibratory pattern to be developed according to its characteristics at present. Fields like Uksim should serve to the release of crisis energy in different degrees. Those who live in a center must have overcome to a great extent certain processes of personal characters. This would allow their vision of reality, the facts that figure it, and the symbolism that compose it to be intimately related to service. That the dynamic to be expressed, to be sustained by the attitude of consciousness willing to fulfill the designs of the cosmic mind. The day will come when what today can only be expressed by a few will be a state of consciousness represented by each and every one of the members of this humanity. The action of mercy, the tool of the planetary consciousness itself, and one of the galactic regency, silently transmutes that which only its activity can change. Uksim, its inner activity, and the profound energy that drives it is mostly unknown by those of us who feel attached to it. In order to access the reality more deeply and in the rhythms that can only be revealed internally, those of us who feel its expression inspire to nothing other than to surrender and fulfill what the eternal present points out to us. An eternal present, which is only when lived with simplicity, a fertile advancement of the future. Note 20. We had climbed slowly up the rocky path. Only some distance separated us from the area where that work of silence and surrender would take place. The stars were perceived with marked energy, even though the sun had just set. The wind was blowing with a certain firmness. It was not strange to our conscience, which its activity symbolized in moments like this. Somehow we knew that these enormous movements of air revealed a particular dynamic of that supramental sphere of existence. When we reached to the top of that hill, we spontaneously orientated ourselves towards a sector of the valley. The wind and the silence became the expression of a single reality. What seemed to be a star accentuated its luminosity. Slowly, it began to move towards the west. We felt deeply accompanied. We perceived intimately that everything related to the energies of donation and giving was being amplified in our consciousness. Genuine surrender was nothing more than a deep state of receptivity, unconditional availability. That night, in those moments, the hill meant the apex of our giving. There was no ambition in us. We knew that what we gave up could only be used for the fulfillment of the unique purpose. That, in that availability, one began to experience the truth of the essence, the indivisibility. The superior leading that which only has a vocation to know it and be its expression. Old residues were removed. Now the wind showed us its unimaginable potential in a controlled way. What can't be removed with its action when that intelligence that directs it so disposes? We perceived powerful impulses of internal origin. With the passing of days, those flows would adopt for the external consciousness a coating on the mental level. How long had it been on that terrace of rocks? The chronological energy had been neutralized. We could only recognize each other, like particles tuning into the unfolding of a cycle, energies active within one stage of the cycle. The contour of the nearby mountains stood out with a halo characteristic of a certain sector of the planet, areas where the presence of intraterrestrial civilizations allows the propagation of energy with the participation of higher laws. Also, the hill where we were and that we were predisposed to descend participated in the emission of that radiation. Silently, while we were descending, we knew that we were being offered to stay under the action of those laws. Something was missing. The wind blew for the last time. Our consciousness simply said yes. A little over a week had passed since the experience took place. The synthesis of what we had experienced was with us. Detachment, which we were continually trying to exercise, does not exempt this type of experience from its dynamism. Only the treatment of some questions brought us fleetingly, without diverting our attention, signs of that internal contact. To perceive the changes and to assist them, it's part of the work in our center. The understanding of certain changes with greater depth is decisive for the expression of each stage that the group assumes. In some of us, the energy of surrender promoted conjunctures that released process from a certain rigidity. We noticed that a certain quality emerged, and its presence clarified us with respect to the future stages of planetary life. Some of the visitors arrived at the place with that attitude, typical of those who seek to overcome the last resistance of an ancient game of forces. Without manifesting it, we could perceive in them an urgency to concretize the donation of their consciousness. Some of us had already gone through this to some degrees and stages, to suffocating needs to give ourselves. To allow the higher counterpart of our being to have these vehicles, to collaborate with the law of purification in a way that was unknown to us until then. Their phases of surrender were different purifications experienced by the being. Only in this way, the offered tool can reach vibratory levels according to the new potentialities. Giving places us on the threshold of future laws. For its development and testing, the transcendence of free will has to be transcended. It allows us to access the energy of the cycles, polarize our consciousness in a vibration that the monada releases by sustaining its purpose. We see our tests, without exception, as an opportunity to serve the planetary consciousness. Through it, the parameters that serve our evolution get expressed. Man's true contact with the hierarchy is consummated when he accesses the energy of giving. It is the way by which we become assistants to the creative life. 3 weeks had passed. The clear perception of another work in that elevation was present. The moon, almost full, illuminated the way. Without difficulty, we found the small ascending path. The breeze was slightly hinting at it. A soft aroma of geraniums was evident. It was not only the smell that registered that subtle aroma. In general, all the senses seemed to participate in its capture, as if the essence that sustained it imprinted its presence in all the terminals of our consciousness. The hierarchy uses certain aromas to symbolize its presence and prepare our consciousness to contact realities on a supraphysical levels. No star moved. The breeze remained soft. Heaven and earth expressed single energy. A single pulse was hidden in everything. We were not observing that, in a way that is inexplicable to the rational mind. We felt we were melting into a great ritual. Our heart obeyed that hidden ceremonial. The nuclei of cosmic life directed it. Nothing could make sense if it was not part of the unique life. We no longer even needed to say yes. We had proven the teaching of the hierarchy once again. The whole cosmos is within our consciousness. Genuine giving and surrender lead us to know this truth intimately. Not 21. How should I accompany my fate? Is it by itself all I need to evolve? The person who asked this question had approached the table we were using on that occasion and had lovingly placed his query next to the questions we were beginning to examine. We felt the urge to take up that role immediately. Written with great care, underneath the words were the name of the interested party and her address. A city more than 1,000 kilometers from the place we were gathered. We knew at once that the reply would be sent by post. Likewise, the certainty that the result of that talk would act as a prelude was installed in our conscious. The answer was sent a few days after our return to the mountains. As we were answering the request, we perceived that in due course the subject will be covered in some of these notes. Nothing that we can understand as an inner search could happen without the energy of fate. Even lacking any apparent condition in the personality, making fate present, we could walk the corridors Tessian has trodden. Its presence allows us to ascend to landings from which we can serve and radiate. The giving, as a genuine and pure donation of our conscious, could not be effective without fate. It is in the external counterpart of existence, the immediately available parameter for our deep inner activity. It is revealed to us to the extent that we have, incarnation after incarnation, partly resolved our response to the inner call. It transcends the action and capacity of thought itself, and because it comes from supernatural levels, it is capable of confirming aspects of reality with force not comparable. What it points out to us carries the rubric of what is exact and correct for the stage of our existence. The action of dissuasive forces cannot go beyond the subtle mantle with which it covers and protects us. It raises the vibration of those places where our existence takes place. Through its energy, our aura raises its vibration and becomes a tool of harmony and synthesis. As we see, our fate, beyond the degree of exteriorization, it manifests a powerful link between the external and the internal, between the material and the immaterial. When it does not know conditioning, it allows us to perceive the action of new laws. This, in itself, makes it an instrument of transcendence of material karma. The question that consciousness in search brought us closer allows us to observe something particularly. Fate, today, needs the development of a quality very little experienced by human consciousness. The quality which owes its lack of consistency to our complicity with certain and determined games of forces. This energy can be defined as fidelity. The application of the potential of fate is immense, the power. The irreplaceable capacity to direct and instruct can only be developed on certain bases. How could we, without the energy of fidelity, offer the inner cores material for their development in these plans? This fidelity translates into an unrestricted openness to what fate itself will detonate with its presence. It is this condition of fate's presence that operates as a key to all true higher manifestation in our consciousness. Life in fate, which has been claimed to be linked to dogmas or religious, is the product of the awakening of our monada. From the movement of approaching our soul to that nucleus, of which it is an extension, on the intuitive level of redeemable humanity. We must be faithful to the impulses that the inner life offers to us. Only in its way do we become auxiliaries of the expression of fate. Expressing unconditional fate must be understood and practiced as the faithful fulfillment of that which the higher will must accomplish through us. This fidelity, when the evolutionary plan requires, it must be translated into work, both material and subtle. Currently, participating as self-consciousness of the transition of the planetary and solar laws, we must see our fate renewed with such context. To manifest the evolutionary plan, It is no more, from a wide and internal point of view, than to accompany without restrictions what results from the action of our fate. The expression of what is right and necessary is the result of our fidelity, openness to what we do not know, and even limited understanding it is hallmark. Remaining impassive in the face of certain dynamics results from its presence. The union with the hierarchy is a symbol of its resonance. In itself, it constitutes the raw material of any evolutionary movement. Its presence as a way to access truth and knowledge infers our consciousness with commitment. The fidelity that must accompany it is forthwith the fulfillment of this commitment. To do tirelessly the best until the end, it comes from the highest, so that the highest manifests itself. Because of its intuitive condition, it promotes elevated activity in all areas linked to this reality. To respond to a call, we must meet certain characteristics. When the call is internal, the mentioned characteristics, if they are of a material nature, can only contribute different shades as long as the main component is present. Only fate gives the capacity to respond. As humanity, we need to go through a deep inner healing. Only fate and a genuine intention to fulfill its purpose of transforming us can make this possible. Our consciousness can live a deeper reality than this level's illusion, that is, knowing that we are truly alive. This is only some of the gifts that He breathes with His sacred presence. Note 22. Approximately 8 years ago, I had the opportunity to live a highly instructive experience. On that occasion, I was given the opportunity to accompany a person to his or her hospitalization in a sanatorium. The purpose of that was to submit the person to a surgical intervention. The admission procedures and the preparations took place in a relaxed atmosphere. The operation was not difficult and served to close a certain karmic process. It was during those hours, during which the operation and the post-operation were taking place, that the experience mentioned above took place. I was quiet outside my assigned room. I was at the end of the long corridor. In those moments, I perceived how I was induced to a certain degree of attention and interiorization. With my gaze, I began to walk the entire length of the corridor. At the opposite end of the corridor, from the one I was in, it was interrupted by the primary corridor on that floor. A few minutes ago, the whole area was deserted. The indication on my own inner self became even more pronounced. I noticed how I was helped to reach a certain state of receptivity. Directly, as I was part of the external reality, I began to perceive through the physical eyes beings and energies that operated in the subtle levels of that hospital. Consciousness, which radiated a harmonizing luminosity. I could notice how their movements were related to energy vortex that were not within my visual range but within my inner senses. At no time did they give me any apparent attention. However, I could feel my consciousness participating in that dynamic. In my mind, profound energy of gratitude emerged. At the moment, I came to know, in that true sense of that term, how much help and love we received on that subtle and inner levels. My consciousness had specific information about the profound activity that the healing entities develop in the function of our purification and evolution. However, I could feel my consciousness participating in that dynamic, In my mind, profound energy of gratitude emerged. At that moment, I came to know, in the true sense of that term, how much help and love we received on the subtle and internal levels. My consciousness had the specific information about the profound activity that the healing entities develop in the function of our purification and evolution. In those moments, it was given to me to know that what I was registering was happening with different variables and intensities in all the places designed to the attention of that sick. I could also sense that this profuse activity was taking place at the different levels that made up the energy spectrum of this clinic. With the information that was given to me, there were elements that refined my understanding of the hidden accompaniment with which we were assisted. The experience was lived with spontaneity. It was shared with some people when we perceived that the energies offered was being needed. In fact, it is not only in areas like that that we are helped in our various process of harmonization and healing. The activity in the supraphysical levels is a constant in every sector of the planetary life. It is known of areas where that happens on specific and dynamic energetic basis, platforms offered in some cases by intraterrestrial civilizations linked to different phases of healing, as it was given to us to perceive in occasions when entering in contact with the external counterpart of some planetary centers like Aurora and Mir Najat. If we could remain receptive and flexible, our participation and collaboration with the development of these issues would allow valuable energy saving. In general, human beings remain refractory to these subtle realities. Their lack of intention to transform makes certain purifying processes extend on junctures that could be notably different. Those healers of the inner worlds had left in my consciousness a deeply embedded energy pattern. As time went by, I understood and consciously embraced different reminded particles of that experience. I was able, among other things, to change the relationship between what I believed and what I knew. I glimpsed aspects of what we call the human archetype with greater depth and spontaneity. My fate took on a connotation that, to define it in some way, I could describe as a maturation. I confirmed, in a way that was unprecedented for my concrete level, that the course of my existence no longer belonged to the human will. Without images or sounds, the certainty that what I had given up was in the hands of its legitimate user that invaded me. Surrender that could only be deepened more and more, contributing a valuable wealth in a continuous renewal of my vows. Once a person consulted us about the represented archetypal man. The first thing that came up in our consciousness was not those explanations that in other occasions we perceived as correct and adequate. We heard ourselves give an explanation of that subject, reducing all pointing to the energy of synthesis. The archetype of a man was a synthesis, the one necessary for him to be able to transpose one of the thresholds of cosmic life and thus to undertake other stages governed by different synthesis archetypes. In short, in this way we were tracked towards and by the absolute synthesis. Our distancing from the archetype is represented by the tendency to drown existence under the superfluous. The cure is the tool that works on that thick shell. Our inner mirrors direct their fire to consummate it. The synthesis consciousness, which operates with the healing energy from the inner levels, unify the action of those fires under the synthesis of the unique purpose of existence. We can attract the cure when we begin to walk the path of synthesis. In the range of our external life, it is made concrete by the simplification of existence. Silence brings inner coherence to its installation. Furthermore, our attention to the levels from which it comes, the sap that has to nourish our assistance to the liberation of the light. Note 23. The energy of reflection and our capacity to express it are consequences of the inner activity that we develop and towards which we must turn. Everything, when reflected upon, must arise within the context, without effort or conditioning. Receptive to the internal energies, it will be their influences that will organize the priority for our existence. The capacity of the concrete mind to raise its vibration is deeply related to the reflective condition. State with multiple gradations, expressions of the different instances of our transference to the intuitive life. The concrete mind expands within a dynamic which does not give rise to its speculative condition, and which forces it to work with a thought of elevation condition. In this way, the subtilization of the physical counterpart of the brain can become concrete. The abstract mind, by its condition of a mirror of the intuitive reality, determines the necessary quality to attract the attention of the concrete mind, to lead it to be attentive to facts and realities of a higher order. It should be taken into account that the legitimate reflective condition does not lead us to an egocentric optic of reality, not to a meticulous and exclusive search for negative aspects. We will be led, by means of our aspiration, to transcend the rigid aspects of the personality. Fundamental conditioner in the capture of the spirit hidden in the event, that reality which sustains and bases the joints of the material world. The reality which is a symbol of that superior thing that the mind needs to recognize in order to become a tool of service. For the men of today, this process of adhesion of the concrete mind to more advanced vibratory levels are perceiving a powerful aid. The condition offered by the new polarity acting on the planet, feminine polarity, of introspective quality, favors the required transition. The human mental archetype is offered from an expanded base. The right consciousness gives the process of the mental expansion unprecedented characteristics. The positive mental quality of discernment receives from this new circuit of energies a supply according to the cycle that humanity and the planet are beginning to develop. The concrete mind raises its vibration when a being enters the path of service. By making its energy available to the whole, it abdicates the search for definitions and reasoning. Our mental level must express a certain degree of unification. In this way, it passes to reflect and use energies that can be defined as attributes of the higher will. Thus, its interaction with the different levels of reality becomes concrete. The ability to reflect allows us a rehearsal of this future unification of the mind, the connection between the abstract and the concrete, its converging in different degrees and intensities. Nowadays, the concrete mind of a percentage of rescuable beings naturally sees the information that in the past would have generated restlessness or disbelief. These beings reflect on the different themes of spiritual information, releasing energies that those who advance in that sense will find at their disposal. Many inspired books operate as strong inducers in this process. They allow, with their quality, that the concrete mind becomes receptive and advance in their learning of neutrality. Thus, for example, it prepares itself to penetrate the internal worlds, concretizing the transcendence of itself. It must contact the evolutionary laws, predisposing that same exercise in the emotional body. Its transformation opens the individual to the path of wisdom. As this process of transcendence of the analytical mind is consolidated, our consciousness collaborates with the recovery of the planetary psychic layer. Our concrete mind needs peace. It must participate in the anchoring of that energy in these plans and levels. The love of the monada towards these levels of consciousness provides support to make it effective. Someone once told us that part of his job was to deactivate the left consciousness. This concept is shared by some people who do not understand that what the analytical and concrete mind achieved as a perfection should not be ignored, only that its mechanism must be reorientated so that it does not interfere with the conduct of existence by our inner consciousness. It must become its tool. The dynamics of the initiations activate the awakening of the right consciousness. This process in a mental field demands the activation of the sleeping vortex of the posterior lobe of the right hemisphere. With its irradiation and pulsation, the right cerebral center supports the illumination of the left counterpart. The elevation of this center and its subsequent service will lead to the unification of the mental polarities assumed by the developed of the cosmosono-medulla field. Having a genuine aspiration to transcend what we are is a sign that we should not miss. It symbolizes a substantial advance in the flexibilization of the concrete mind. The silence that we prepare to know will allow us to access the glimpse of that peace that corresponds to us. Its destiny within the harmonization of material levels is deeply linked to reflecting the higher order participating in the organization of concrete existence. Note 24. Among the correspondence that reached us this week, there is a letter from Uruguay. Whoever writes to us declares to live in the city of Salto and to be an assiduous reader of this newspaper. The reasons for her letter reveal aspirations typical of those who with firmness are evolutionary leading their lives. Our reader makes a request. Would it be possible sometime in a newspaper to tell us about the so-called involutive forces? Beyond the possibility, the treatment of the suggested topic is perceived as timely. According to the cycle and the stages through which humanity passes, they are known by different names: involution forces, retrograde or dissuasive forces, as well as demon or devil. How many people are aware of their influences and existence? How many people are aware of their power and control? How and when can we transcend them? We will try to work through these questions together. Our bodies, because of their type of constituent material, harbor these forces. We attract them by affinity to strengthen our evolutionary orientation. Everything could have turned out differently. They were there to point out a direction precisely the opposite of our evolutionary purpose. Our learning consisted of transcending them and gradually accomplishing the union with our internal nuclei. Far from that accomplishment, we deeply identify it with their action. Because it is limited in its range of action to the strip of existence that goes from the concrete mental to the concrete physical, the layer of the planetary psyche is its main settlement. Thought forms are its powerful tools: jealousy, competitiveness, anguish, the search for satisfaction, envy, hypocrisy, fears, possessiveness, vanity, pride, the desire for power or recognition are symbols of its presence and dominance. At present, they carry out their work with effective dynamics in all the power nuclei that make up this surface civilization. A great number of beings serve their dark purposes with or without being conscious of it. The current genetic code cannot offer guarantees for its transcendence given to the current conditions of the planet and humanity. In this sense, the help provided by the extraterrestrial civilizations is fundamental. The incorporation of cosmic genes coming from planetary universes governed by the superior evolutionary law allows the shaping of vibrations in the external plans of humanity outside the common pattern of affinity. Free will, as this humanity interprets this energy, becoming a sustaining mechanism of its action. Choice presents no other option than to opt for some degree of its influence and presence. These forces ignore the inner vibratory pattern. They attack it although they don't know it. For this reason, for example, do not have elements of extreme courage to oppose our determined attitude of persistence when the energy of persistence is directed towards the inner search. They do not register silence in its true and hidden meaning. In trying to avoid our stillness and silence, they do not exercise their action in the direction of these elements. They cannot register their vibration and interfere with them. The interfering action is indirect in relation to this. By perceiving that we do not respond to their influences with a certain intensity, these dissuasive forces increase their pressure in moments where we seek to reinforce the inner harmony. In other words, from a certain point of view, they do not know what it is they are distancing us from with their presence and interference. Being limited to the external counterpart of life puts a precise framework into their actions. In reality, in order to carry out their work, they develop a consistency and alterability of perfect purposes. If we could be natural to them, we would be able to enjoy that teaching, for which they are irreplaceable. The current planetary situation is the terrain where they express themselves most and best. The hierarchy has provided, in relation to them, precious indications for their neutralization. Mainly, we are told not to confront them. Any type of conflict favors and nourishes them. The cultivation of silence and attention disarticulates their action. Silence is a powerful tool for harmonizing material existence. Attention allows us to perceive its insinuations at a point where strengthening our attitude is still possible and effective. These forces are often disguised as intellectuality and spirituality. It is common, due to the degree of deviation that this civilization has, to see them expressed in the different manifestations of what we call art, as well as in the media. They find in the multiple variables of camouflaged magic vast possibilities. Some world governments are icons of their supremacy in the concrete level of existence. They cannot extinguish the fire of truth in those who, with faith and aspiration, the answer to the inner call happens. Our surrender to the higher will incapacitates them. Persistence without fissures, in assistance to the consummation of the evolutionary plan and the development of the service, allows the energies in charge of its dissolution to find in us a valuable assistance. Uksim, its internal activity and the deep energy that drives it, is largely unknown to those of us who feel connected to it. In order to gain access to that reality profoundly, and in rhythms that can only be revealed within those of us who feel its expression, aspire to nothing other than to give ourselves and fulfill what the internal present points to us. An internal present which is only, when lived with simplicity, fertile advancement of the future.